Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and this is the long-awaited Priest and Druid synergy video. So I've been wanting to make this video for quite a bit, and it just took me a little bit because, as you know with a lot of my videos, some of them aren't like highly edited. I don't tend to do that, right? It just saves me time in terms of like the editing and stuff like that, and in most cases I feel like, it's not super necessary to do a lot of editing for these types of videos. It's more about getting the information out, right? And if there were circumstances where I feel like editing would be like super beneficial, I would do that in a video. But I think for the most part, it's pretty easy to to just do the videos like I've been doing. However, that being said, I do still take some care in terms of trying to organize my thoughts in these and stuff like that. And in some of the videos, it's a bit more straightforward. And kind of like some of the topics logically flow into each other. There's like a logical progression of like, okay, you need to explain this first, and it would make sense to logically explain the next thing. But in a video like this, it's kind of, you could almost start anywhere, right? It's a bit all over, so you'll tend to notice that when I do make these types of videos, I'll have this little like note sheet right here, right? And I'll kind of like try and go through that a bit, and that's going to be like my guide for stuff like this. So yeah, it just took me a little bit to decide how I want to organize it and stuff like that. And sometimes I'll just like, I'll be doing a video and then I'll just do a whole nother take of it or something if I don't like the way the first one's going. So sometimes I'll do that a couple times. We've done that for this one. So we've changed things around a little bit, and I think I have it how I like. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. Paladin stuff is on the horizon. I have a level 15 Paladin. We're getting attacked by South Sea swashbucklers right now, but okay, so yeah, Paladin stuff is on the horizon. Paladin's like around level 15 or 17. Should be capping in the next couple days. Hopefully, I'll get running this lockout. I'm unsure if that's going to be the case, but probably definitely next lockout. And as you guys know, like I like to play something before I talk about it. Like I don't mind doing what we did before the season came out, right? Which is just reacting to potentialities and what could possibly be the case. But once the stuff is out and it's playable, I don't want to give you guys like kind of bad information if I haven't played the class itself, right? It's fun to speculate and everything like that. But once the stuff is available to be played, then you really should play it, I feel like, before you're just giving information out on it, right? And in terms of Shaman, that may, I know there's like one person that had responded recently about Shaman videos. I think they're a Shaman player, so Shaman stuff is probably going to be a little bit later. What I may do is I may talk to somebody that I know on Horde side that does like Shaman stuff and see if I can do maybe a video with them, or at least get their thoughts and then get permission to use them in the video, because it may be a little bit before I'm able to really do Shaman, because I'm going to level a Horde character, I believe, but I think it's going to be a Druid for farming purposes first, and then it's probably going to be a Shaman. So that might be a little bit on the back burner. Still trying to get everything kind of set away and squared away on the Alliance side first. So that's kind of like the what's on the horizon, and there's also going to be some other videos. I actually have some topics right here. I might as well just show them now. This is like misassessing issues. This is a comment somebody left. It was like a really good comment. It's basically just like how, people misassessing issues in a raid type setting can actually like make it so it feels like it's impossible to clear something that's actually really easy. I think that's a really good thing for BFD. I'm going to get that one out probably next, actually, because it's more relevant now. And then don't cast penance on the boss. This is more like a short PSA video. I may release this also in like a couple days. Again, some stuff like that, don't take it too seriously. Like, it's not in every circumstance type of thing. But I think there's just a lot of cases where I see people casting penance on the boss that's probably not optimal. So the video is going to be about that. And then I want to do an int versus spirit video, because I see a lot of misinformation regarding this. And I have an idea for a really cool thumbnail for that one. So I normally hate making the thumbnails, because I'm just not very artistically inclined. But I feel like this one I have a particularly good idea for, and it's going to be funny, so you guys should like that. But yeah, well, so now we can pretty much just get right into the video, and right off the bat, when we say synergy, I kind of want to define synergy a bit, and like how, not necessarily the actual dictionary definition, but what are we talking about when we're talking about class synergy in WoW for healing specifically in like BFD, Season of Discovery, right? And for me, it really comes down to like how do the play styles mesh or complement each other. I have like 3 things here, right? And then how do the abilities kind of mesh or complement each other? And then is there like unique buffs or utility that some of these things are bringing that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise, right? So that's kind of like how I look at the synergy. And then we're going to go into the talents a bit, which may be a bit redundant, so you can just skip that part if you already know about the talents. But it's basically going to be the same stuff that you saw in the Priest and Druid videos individually. And then, because the talents aren't like specific to their synergy, so for example, it's not like you take a specific talent build when you're healing with Priest or anything like that. For Druid, you can kind of do something like that a little bit, but I'll explain that when we get there. It's not really that major, though. And then the other numbers here are just like kind of talking points that I wanted to organize the video by. So yeah, let's get into things first. We'll talk about kind of like buffs and utility, since that's like the easiest one, right? So obviously with Priest, it's really nice having Priest in the raid because you get powered fortitude, right? And you can supplement stuff with scrolls. I believe that the scrolls tend to be not as good as the actual buff, although maybe if you have like the highest level scrolls, that's possible. But I think like int gives like 9 int or something, and the int scroll gives like 8, for example. I haven't used a fortitude scroll really because there's almost always a priest in every group. But I think that in the very least, even if the base buff that you get is the same as the scroll, a lot of these classes typically have talents that will augment like what their buff gives. Essentially, it'll buff their buff. So therefore, that makes the buffs a little bit better if they come from the classes themselves, right? And also, the odds that like in your pug group, people are going to have scrolls for all types of buffs, it's not likely, right? So it's kind of nice when you can just have something like a priest. So priest is always good for fortitude, and in this particular case, you're not really bringing a shadow in most cases, right? They're just not very good right now, and the odds that you're going to have a shadow priest in your group is not going to be great. So if you're going to have a priest, it's probably going to be a healing priest, which is really nice because they just bring that fortitude buff straight away. And then on Druid side of things, so Druids have Mark, and Druids are a pretty popular class because Feral and Wind Fury, right? It's the only way for Alliance to get it right now. And so you're probably going to have Ferals in your group who can also buff Mark. And to be honest, buffing Mark is not like buffing Fort because it's like way less mana and it's way easier to buff. However, I believe that Druids tend not to get, Feral Druids at least, I don't know about Tank Druids, I don't think Tank Druids get this either, but they don't get the Mark of the Wild buff, and that's because they need to power shift, I believe, which requires that they have those 5 points, and I can actually go into it right here. So Druids will take these 5 points, I believe, the DPS. Like, they'll do something like 5 points in here. And then I don't know what they talent to get here, but they basically do something like this, right? I think this is like the level 25 build. They get the clear casting and then this. Or maybe they take this, I'm not entirely sure. But regardless, they don't take improved Mark of the Wild. So, you are getting Imp Mark with the Resto Druid, which is nice in most cases at least. It's not the end of the world. Let's just put points in this to show you guys. So it's 35%. I mean, 35% is like a lot. The main issue is that at this level, the values that you're getting from Mark are kind of low, right? So 35% of a small value is not anything to write home about, I guess. But then again, in a relative sense, you're not getting as many stats per level at this level anyway, right? So every point of stat means more than it would at like level 60 or something like that, obviously. So it's not like nothing, but I don't think it's like too significant, but that is something. Another thing about Druid that's kind of bringing to the table is, so obviously both Druids bring Fairy Fire, but right now, typically what would happen if you have a Feral Druid in your raid is they would get Fairy Fire Feral, which basically allows it to be cast in like cat form, and I think it's like instant. I don't even know if it uses a GCD. Yeah, I'm not even sure. Well, the other one's instant too, but I'm not even sure if this uses like a GCD. It might. So it's just very easy for Ferals to like keep up their own Fairy Fire, and that's not necessarily the case now. I think what basically has to happen is that when you do the power shifting thing, on Feral, when you go into human form or whatever, then you would like recast Fairy Fire on the boss, and then you go back into cat, which isn't the end of the world, but it does cost a GCD, right? So by having a Resto Druid who can just mark stuff all the time, it's nice. And also, like, this raid is not very trash intensive, but if the raid was trash intensive, being able to easily put Fairy Fire on multiple things is kind of nice. And I mean, you can still do that in this raid. Like, typically when I'm running on the Druid, like, as long as mana is not really a constraint, like if we're not pulling like a ton of stuff, I'll try and just throw up Fairy Fire on as many things as possible. Right, and then obviously you Fairy Fire on the pull, so the Druid doesn't have to worry about it on the pull, and he pretty much never has to worry about it at all if you're Resto, because it's just super easy. It's like 1 GCD, which is like nothing for you in most cases, and you can pretty much permanently keep Fairy Fire up all the time. So that's another advantage of Resto Druid, right? So they both bring some good things to the raid. I'd say obviously Priest is bringing the more crucial buffs, right? Whereas like Druid, a lot of times you're gonna have Mark, you're gonna have the ability to cast Fairy Fire and stuff like that, right? So those are not as critical, but on the Priest side of things, definitely pretty huge to at least have the fort. Now, I think so that's why I feel like for this particular pairing, like I'll bring the thing back up again here. The buffs and utility is not like a super big concern here, right? And we're gonna talk about like abilities and playstyle next, and they're both kind of like, I have them separate here, but they both kind of like play into the same thing, right? So we'll talk about those together. And basically, how I would put it is that the Druid's playstyle is that you want to be doing, because of the runes you take, right, which is we'll get into here. So the runes you take are going to be Fury of the Storm Rage, Wild Growth, and Star Surge, right, which we already talked about in the Druid video. Now, because 2 of these are basically DPS runes, right, you're going to want to be casting as many Wraths and Star Surges as possible. So you're going to want to be doing like as much damage as possible. To play like optimally at least, right? And what would impede that is you needing to cast like a lot of hard cast healing spells. Like Wild Growth works really well with these 2 abilities, right? Because it's an instant cast and it's kind of like an AoE heal. So not only can it heal multiple people at once, that otherwise you'd have to individually healing touch all those people, but the spell is actually instant. And it's actually just very strong right now. I think it's like a little bit overtuned even. It does just a lot of healing for the mana. So there's really good synergy between these types of abilities, because the idea is you want to be able to just like be training the boss with Fury of the Storm Rage, and then you can actually save procs for when you need the instant procs on your healing touch, right? And then you're basically just dropping a Wild Growth when AoE damage comes out, and you're Star Surging on cooldown. And that's kind of like your play style that you want to have. So you want like a play style that is going to allow for direct healing, right? And Priest's playstyle, in my opinion, is perfectly suited to complement the Druids, because what happens with Priest, I'll actually go into just the Priest talents here, right, is you take a Void Plague, right? You can take well, I'll just put Penance here, and then you can take Homunculi or Mending, but it kind of works actually the same way. So basically, if you're a Priest, right, well, we'll do the Homunculi version first. If you're a Priest and you're running Homunculi, then what you're doing is on the pull, you're basically using Homunculi right at the start, barring like certain things. So for example, Lorgish Jet, you don't want to be using Homunculi, I think, because they just die to all the miscellaneous AoE. And then, from what I've heard at least, I mean, I'm sure maybe there's like certain scenarios where they won't die. If the ball doesn't get kited through the melee or something like that, or I'm not sure if they take lightning totem damage, to be honest. But I don't take it for Lorgish Jet, and I don't take it for the turtle. I do use it on the turtle, but we use it after the shield breaks, right? Because if you do it before the shield breaks, it actually just kills all the homunculi. However, in most fights, you're able to just pop this on the pull, right? And then you throw up a Void Plague, and then you start wanding immediately. And the idea is that you don't need to be like hard casting anything, right? Like a lot of your damage is like the homunculi function sort of as like a dot in their own way, right? Because it's just you summon them and then you set it and forget it. They're good to go. You don't have to do anything else with them. You don't even have to really control them because you can't micro them or control them. They're not a normal pet. They're just a companion. And then your Void Plague, you're putting this up, this lasts like, what, 16 seconds? Oh, 18 seconds. Yeah, so, yeah, it lasts 18 seconds, which is huge. So you just toss that up one time. This is also really good in terms of your mana because it doesn't cost a ton of mana to put up. And in addition to that, it doesn't really interrupt your 5-second rule very much because you're only casting it once every 18 seconds, right? So that's actually huge. And then your wanding, which can basically be canceled at any time, and you know, you're not really missing like you're not really missing any. I mean, I guess technically, if you were to cancel like during the auto, you'd miss that auto. But you like to cancel a wand auto animation is not really a huge deal, right? You're just missing out on like 50 damage or something like that. So basically, as the priest, you can be this tank healer because you have something like penance, right? And like, so how you're gonna play it as priest is you're gonna open homunculi on a normal boss, right? You're gonna toss a void plague up, and you're gonna start wanding, and you're gonna let your tank or whoever's like essentially taking the melee damage for that boss, which probably should be the tank, right? Get chunked out a little bit to like 50%, and you're just training the boss the whole time, and then you just hit penance, and they return to basically full HP, and you can go right back to wanding. You don't have to reapply Void Plague yet, so you're still in the 5-second rule. If you do need to reapply Void Plague, the time you want to reapply it is after you cast Penance, right? Because obviously you just got into the 5-second, like you just interrupted your 5-second rule by casting Penance, so you might as well use the Void Plague right after if the duration is close to expiring. I wouldn't really worry about dot clipping so much or anything like that in this version, right? Because we're not trying to like maximize damage or damage per mana like to that degree. It's not really that big a deal. The idea is that you just want the dot on the boss. Like if the dot is close to expiring, then you want to use it with penance so that you don't have to interrupt your regen later on, essentially, right? So yeah, you basically just want to be like relying on penance to heal in a lot of these cases, or you could even do Circle of Healing as well. Circle of Healing is a bit more mana intensive, right? And typically this spell is not really thought to be a single target spell, right? It's obviously a group heal spell, as you can see, but once you get really good gear and you have pretty fast clear times and stuff like that, you can actually kind of use this as like a catch-all in a lot of cases to kind of like substitute for penance. And what I mean by that is, so you have this in case you need to heal a group, right? But you can at any moment just decide like, hey, like I need this as like an instant heal. And then you just insta-cast it on your tank, and it's sort of like penance. Now, it's just not anywhere near as mana efficient, right? So if you have bad gear or you have long kill times or something, you don't really want to be doing that very often. But it is an option if you take this spell. Like, don't think like, I can't use... I feel like some people get very trapped into what spells are supposed to be archetype-wise, right? So it's like, well, I'd never use the AoE spell on a single target. And it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of cases where you probably should, right? And it's not, it's not something you want to do necessarily super consistently. You don't want to be trying to do it, but you want to be ready and available to do it when something like that is necessary, essentially, right? So basically, yeah, you want to be like healing as little as possible, and then like penancing, or if your Circle of Healing, again, like you really probably wouldn't want to be doing that, so you'd have to just swap to hard casting heal at that point, which is what makes penance really nice in some of these fights, right? Is that penance is the thing that allows you to have higher uptime on your damage, because you can use that as like your instant supplementary heal. And spoiler, this is actually going to be the reason that I talk about in the other video as to like why you don't DPS with penance, right? Because it's just so effective healing wise and lets you maintain your uptime basically. But the long and short of this is that because Priest is doing a lot of like kind of like dot damage, like so they have the dot on there, and they're like you could almost think of the wand in a sense as like a dot, right? Where they don't have to be like hard casting, right? They have like every individual wand hit is small. So if you have to interrupt yourself to cast heal, it's not really the biggest deal. But on Druid, if you have to interrupt to cast Healing Touch, not only do you have to stop your Wrath, which, I mean, you could compare Wrath to Wand, right? Like, it makes sense to be like, well, Wrath is sort of just like a 1.5 second cast, right? It's like a wand that you're hard casting, essentially. But it's like, the problem is you also have the Star Surge CD, right? And when you start having to incorporate a lot of healing touches into your rotation, what happens is it makes it very difficult to cast that Star Surge on cooldown. So you're losing like a lot of damage there. As Druid, like you're basically losing more than Priest, right? Because the Priest, the Void Plague, and the Homunculi are AFK. The only thing you're interrupting to actually heal is your wand, right? Whereas like the Druid, everything is disrupted when you have to cast heals. There'll even be some cases potentially where if you didn't have the foresight to maybe refresh Fairy Fire early enough, you may actually have to like forego having Fairy Fire on the boss for a couple seconds to like finish casting some much needed healing touches or something like that, you know, because all these things cost globals and you can't do them at the same time. So that's kind of what I mean by like playstyle and how the playstyles complement each other really well, right? Is that the Priest is just really good at doing that single target healing, and the thing is like the single target healing is what's going to happen in most of BFD, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a consistent trend for most of the game, right? It tends to be the case even in retail to some degree, although they've added a lot more AoE stuff into that game as the years have gone on. But I feel like most bosses tend to follow the pattern of, you know, at one point it's basically just like the tanks taking damage, right? And then it's maybe people taking damage if they make a mistake, but it's all damage that can be avoided. So if your raid is playing well, it's pretty much just like the tank. And then there'll be like a phase of the fight where there's AoE, right? And Priest just allows you to navigate that super well because you can cover all of the base healing required for the fight, which is basically going to be like healing on the tank, while the Druid just gets to blast without having to worry at all. So that's why there's like super synergy there in terms of the play style, right? And that also involves like the abilities, like I was saying, like Homunculi and Void Plague versus Fury of the Storm Rage and Star Surge and stuff like that, and Wild Growth. So that's kind of like how all that comes together in terms of this stuff. And then we're going to talk about the talents here, right? So I'm just going to briefly go through the talents and what I'd use. So I take the 5 out of 5 wand just for extra wand damage on Priest, right? For wanting the boss. Take Improved Powered Shield, take this, Meditation, Inner Focus. You can use this with, like I usually try and couple this. If I'm running Penance, I couple it with a max rank heal. And if I'm using Circle of Healing, I'll try and use it with that, but you can use it with either one. Put 3 points in that, and then I put 2 points in here just because like there'll be some cases where you'll have like random ads beating on you, like on Lorgit's Jet sometimes, or just trash in the instance in general, right? And everybody's world buff and stuff, so they don't want to die. So I just take this in case, because I don't think that like, you know, having 2 points in this or 2 points in this is really going to be like the game breaker, right? It's just better off to have a couple points in this and to be extra safe there. So this is a Priest build, and I think like as you get more gear, you know, you could actually definitely swap to something if you wanted like something like this, right? Where you just take Divine Fury, and you maybe take this, put a point in that, and then do something like that. So you could absolutely do something like that, but then you give up a little bit of your wand damage, which isn't the end of the world. I'm going to make a video on that too, like in terms of like how much damage are we actually getting having healers do damage. But that'll be a little bit later down the pipeline. So you could do this build if you wanted to. I think that like it's weird because the more gear that you get, right, you think meditation is going to be better, which is kind of true because typically the case with Prebis and getting gear is that right off the bat, you're getting greens that have like 1 or 2 stats, right? So you're either getting like a tenant green or you're getting like an intelligence spirit green, right? Or an intelligence stamina green. So the idea is when you upgrade to blues, a lot of that upgrade is that you're now being budgeted all 3 stats. Like you're getting stamina, spirit, and intelligence. Now, so basically the idea is that the more you fill out your kit, the more spirit you're going to gain, and therefore this talent becomes more valuable. But at the same time, this talent also becomes less necessary, right? Because as everybody in the raid gets more geared, you're killing things quicker. So it's kind of just something to keep in mind, because there's going to be a lot of cases where you probably almost don't feel this at all if you have like a really good group, right? You could just drop this entirely almost and go down this side to get the reduced cast time on the healing. I'm not really sure which one I like better yet. I do a lot of pugging, so I tend to just stick to this, is what I do for now. But this isn't like wrong, like I said, right? And then on the Druid side of things, right, we'll go back into Druid. So for Druid, you are looking at basically this, and then this for the reduced healing touch, and then reflection, and then you can do some interesting things here, right? So what you can do is you can either put 3 points in this, right, which is what I have now. And again, this is mostly because I do a lot of pugging, right? So I like the idea of kind of having this. Like, my thought process is that I don't really know if it's doing a ton, you know, I can calculate what it's doing, obviously, but what I mean is, like, how often do I know going into a raid if that's going to be the difference maker? Well, I can't say that I know, obviously, right? But I'd rather have it than not have it. It's kind of my mentality when I don't know all the other circumstances, right? I'd rather have the little bit of extra regen. However, you can easily just take points out of this and put them in here, right? You can take the point out of this and put an insect swarm for more damage. Insect swarm is pretty mana efficient damage. Or at least doesn't cost that much, right? So, and it also reduces the boss's hit a little bit. So you can do tons of stuff like that. It's basically whatever you want to do, you know? So I would either go, I'd either do that, or I'd put points in this and remove those, or you can you can even remove one from there, put it in an insect swarm. You can do whatever variation of anything with this. I'd say the core is you probably want this. Just in the case of if you have to cast Healing Touch, it's nice to have. But again, in a really good group, you're probably not going to be hard casting Healing Touch very often. So it kind of just depends on what you're doing. And as a priest-druid combo, and specifically, this is probably going to be not a very useful thing most of the time. But again, if you're not familiar with the priest you're healing with, you may want to have this anyway, just in the event that you actually need it. But you shouldn't be casting too many healing touches as priest-druid, ideally speaking, right? And that goes back to the playstyle thing we were talking about. So that's just the talents really quick, right? And we can get back into the kind of core things of the video, right? So why would you want to run this dual setup? It's kind of that's the way I'm kind of coming at this, right? And we're kind of asking questions and making statements here with these bullet point things. So not that hard to heal, so off heal may be better than healer. So what we mean here is that the dungeon itself is it's very one healable in most cases, right? Especially with good damage, and especially if you're not actually speed running. So for example, if you're drinking after bosses and everything like that, you're kind of drinking to full. If they're going to allow you to drink when you need to on trash and stuff like that, then it's really not a difficult dungeon to solo heal, especially with very good damage. And that means that a lot of times what you may want to do in that case is the druid is nice, it pairs with the priest, because the priest is kind of your primary healer, right? And they're the one that's, they're doing a bit of damage with the homunculi if they take homunculi. They're doing a bit of damage with wand, and they're doing a bit of damage with the dot. But they're still there, primarily to be the healer. So if you need somebody to do the hard casting, for example, if, just getting by with penance isn't enough, or maybe you didn't take penance because you took Circle of Healing, they can sit there and cast heal, lesser heal, or whatever. They have the toolkit, the complete toolkit. They have the shield, they have the flash heal for the quick 1.5 second heal that does 200 healing. Druid can't match that, right? They have a hot that matches Druid's hot. They have, in Renew, they have a Circle of Healing, which is kind of like Wild Growth, right? They have Penance if they swap that rune out. So they're kind of the the overall, like, most flexible, best healer. But then you bring the Druid in, and the idea with the Druid is that, you're not going to really be needing to heal that often. So Druid's kit leans itself really well into DPSing when you don't have to heal. But hey, if you do have to heal, you still at least have the other healer there. Like if you bring another Warlock, or you bring another Warrior, and you actually need more healing for whatever reason, there's no way to get it, right? Whereas like Druid, you have a way to get it, and because of how the Druid deals damage, it's not really wasting its mana. So it's not a scenario like where it would have been before. Like, for example, let's say that you had a balanced Druid and a Priest, right? Or you had a Druid-Priest combo, and you're trying to run Druid-Priest, but you don't have this, you don't have the 6 mana cost Star Surge, right? And you do not have the Fury of the Storm Rage. So what you're doing there is you're basically like wasting a bunch of mana casting Wraths and something like Star Surge or whatever, or maybe even Starfire if this wasn't in the game. And then by the time like you find out during the fight, like, oh, we really need more healing here, like we need somebody else to pick up the slack, like the Priest is going or something. What would happen is you would just be out of mana essentially, right? Because you've been casting like you're a caster the whole time. But because of how the Druid's kit is built in SOD, you're basically 100% mana as a Druid if you're doing this. If you're casting Star Surge and you're casting Fury of the Storm, right? And Fairy Fire. And the only way you really tend to drain your mana is if you also kind of get a little bit greedy and add Moonfire and Sunfire into the mix. You can do that if you want, but basically it's unnecessary to do that. Like, you still do reasonable damage without adding the 2 dots in, and your mana will basically be at 100%. So if the Priest, you can think of it as your Priest is effectively solo healing, right? And then you're helping out in the AoE scenarios with Wild Growth. And if you really need a fallback healer, like if you really need that person, like your Priest is going for whatever reason, or you need to pick up heals during trash, you can just stop doing your damage and start casting Healing Touches, and you still have a ton of mana left, right? So that is kind of like the idea there. In terms of not needing, you don't really need 2 full healers, so you want to pick the off heal, and you want to have the off heal that does like the best damage, right? And like right now, that's basically Druid is how I would say it. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, Priest covers for Druid weaknesses and vice versa. Now this is mostly for the fact that, like we were just talking about, where a Druid wants to be hard casting the entire time, like Wrath and then casting Star Surge. So their weakness is kind of like tank healing, which is a bit ironic because in the actual vanilla version of WoW, a lot of times Druids were saddled to be like the cancel cast tank healer, right? Where you would just cancel cast high ranks of Healing Touch on the tank if you wanted to play Druid in like a super mana efficient way. But in this version, they're not so great at tank healing, right? Because they want to be casting all the other spells. So if they're casting, like I said before, tons of Healing Touches, they're just not really going to be able to do that. So that's where the Priest really comes in with like Penance, right? Because the Penance is like a super busted tank healing spell, and that allows not only the Priest to have high uptime, like I said before, but the Druid to have really high uptime on all their spells, right? And then the Druid kind of covers for the Priest weakness, where if the Priest takes Penance, right, especially if they take Penance and Homunculi, then the one thing that they're sort of lacking is like AoE healing, because if you don't have either of those, then you don't really have any AoE healing as a Priest, right? And hey, that's fine, because Wild Growth is actually really, really good. And it's also, like I said, it's very non-invasive for a Druid. They just cast it, and then they go right back to their rotation. And it's like healing in the background while they do damage, right? And especially if you have something like, especially if the Priest is running Palm or something, Wild Growth with Palm should be able to handle pretty much any AoE scenario. And there's also even synergy between things like Palm and Wild Growth, because now a whole group is being healed by a Hot at one time, right? So Palm is just gonna, if the Palm bounces to targets in that group, it's just gonna instantly bounce. So you get like really efficient use out of Palm, because now you don't have to be wasting GCDs on things like Renew to move the Palm or anything like that, or Lesser Heal or anything of that sort, right? It's basically you're putting it on and it's moving automatically. So regardless of what you take, if you take Homunculi or Palm or something, having the Druid there that has the wild growth, it's just like really good, right, to be able to cover for your sort of weaknesses. In a way, it's like Priest sort of doesn't really have weaknesses because, I mean, they could just take Circle of Healing anytime they want, right? However, if you take Circle of Healing, you don't really have the same tank healing capacity, and you're going to be nerfing your damage a little bit because you're going to have to be hard casting more heals instead of just using something like Penance. You're also going to be eating up into your mana efficiency because Penance is just such a mana efficient heal that like casting normal heal in most cases can't really compete with it, assuming like you're getting the most value out of Penance and you're using it properly, right? So there's just not there's like a lot of reasons why you would want to take Penance, I feel like, in a normal comp and just leave the AoE healing to Druid. There can be certain fights, for example, like the Turtle. I think I've mentioned this in the other videos where, like you just have the Priest swap to Circle of Healing. And then I also swap on the Murloc. I tend to swap because you don't really need Penance on that fight for the most part. And in a way, Circle of Healing tends to act like an AoE Penance, right? You're kind of using Circle of Healing for the same function that you use Penance on, saving somebody. But it allows you the opportunity where if multiple people are wounded at once from the Shadowy Murlocs during the Murloc phase, you can actually heal them all at once, whereas with Penance, you can only target one person, right? So obviously, you can bring Circle of Healing into the mix as Priest, but I think that having like in a run where you're concerned about mana and mana efficiency and maybe your damage from your DPS isn't quite there yet, I think running Penance is just really good to run with Druid because, the cooldown on Wild Growth is not that long, and a lot of times when you do need to heal AoE damage, it's unlikely that it's going to be fatal within 6 seconds. And what I mean by that is, like, let's take the Turtle and Lorgus Jet as the two obvious examples of times where you're going to potentially need to AoE heal. So let's say a totem comes out on Lorgus, and a bunch of the DPS hit it, and they get chunked to like half, right? Well, the thing is they can afford, like, let's say both groups get chunked to half, right? Sure, if, you had a Priest and a Druid and they both had their AoE heal, Priest could circle one group, Druid could Wild Growth the other, and that's a perfectly fine way to play it. And in that case, you'd want your Priest probably to circle the tank group, so the tank gets the instant heal there, especially if he's under threat from, like, the Windfury totem. But let's say you didn't have the Priest take circle, right? The Priest is taking Penance for, to heal the big damage coming in from Lorgus when he gets Windfury. So what your Druid does is he just drops a heal on whichever group first, basically. Probably the tank group in that situation. And then the other group is at half for a little bit, but they're not really going to die because there shouldn't be any more damage coming out, right, until the next Lightning Totem comes around. So he has plenty of time to heal up both groups before the next set of damage. And it's the same thing with the Turtle boss, right, where, you could easily take Penance on that fight as the Priest to save people who are going to get knocked around by, like, the bubbles, right? Because it's the same concept where once the actual shell explodes, there's not really going to be many bubbles, like, after that. Like, if somebody didn't get knocked into a bubble after the shell explodes, then they're not dying until the next explosion phase. So you have plenty of time as a Druid to drop a Wild Growth on one group, wait the cooldown, drop a Wild Growth on another group, and then, everybody's perfectly back to full health, right? So I think that's why I would suggest Penance, and I think Penance has, like, a really just good synergy with the Druid because it allows the Priest to do that tank healing, and the Druid covers all the AoE. And let's go into the next section here, which is Druid damage requires another tank healer to be fully... Oh, yeah, okay. So this is, like, the concept that we're saying, like, but it's posing an additional question onto it, right? So it's like, so since Druid damage requires, like, a tank healer, right, if you're trying to fully optimize it, well, why wouldn't you just take a Paladin, right? They're tank healers instead of a Priest. Wouldn't that be, like, kind of like the optimal scenario? And, you still kind of have the same benefit with that combination, you think, in theory, because the Druid is going to do the AoE healing, and the Paladin's going to do the single target healing. So there shouldn't really be a problem, right? And I would say there's not really a problem in terms of just the strict combination of utility and playstyle between those two classes. What mostly comes into play there is the abilities, where Priest has a magic dispel, which I guess should have been mentioned in the first part of the ability section, which can be very useful on like boss like Kelris, for example, or it can dispel fears on the Murloc, etc. And Paladin actually does get magic dispel, but they don't have it at this level. So a lot of times, like, people are just going to want to take Priest in the case of the, to have the magic dispel. Like, typically you're supposed to use a free action potion on Kelris, but, I think a lot of groups like to have a Priest in there in case people aren't popping them and stuff like that. It's just nice to be able to get that ability off people. And they typically only use free action potion in phase 2. So if a change goes out in phase 1, there's nobody that can remove the debuff if it's Druid Paladin. So that's just one thing about why you would use a Priest. But also, one of the issues is that in this particular phase, Paladin's healing on the tank is nowhere near as good, in my opinion, as a Priest. Just in terms of like snap putback healing. Because basically Holy Light is a very mana inefficient spell, even though it heals for a lot. And it has like a decently long cast time, right? It's not like a flash heal or a shield or a penance or anything like that. So issue that you kind of run into is like if the Holy Light is bombing a healing spell, Holy Light's on like the tank, or if he's using Beacon on the tank and bombing them on somebody else, he's gonna go like relatively quickly if you don't have a good group, right? Especially because Beacon costs a decent amount of mana. So I mean, you obviously want to precast Beacon. But sometimes there's tank swaps and stuff where you need to like recast it. And the other problem is that using just spamming Flashlight, sometimes that may not be enough, because right now our Flashlight, I believe, is ranked 20 on a Paladin. And I'll have more intimate knowledge about this obviously when I start healing on my Paladin for the first time. But the idea is that since it's not really close to the level cap, the amount of healing it's doing is not really that great. Priest and Druid tend to have a lot of benefits from the runes because all the runes scale per level, right? Which is why Penance is so good. It's why Palm is so good. It's why Wild Growth is so good. Paladins don't have like a really direct AoE or any type of heal that you get through the runes, right? It's basically just Beacon is like the main healer thing, but that just duplicates your heal. And the problem is that it's duplicating a heal that is already too low level, essentially, at this point, right? To do, like, a ton of significant healing. So, on a fight like Lorgish Jet, where the tank is getting really slammed, sometimes, like, spam casting that Flash of Light is just not really going to cut it in some cases, right? And not only that, but Paladin just doesn't have the safety net of the Priest of having Shield and Penance available to them, right? There's no way they can, like... The only thing a Paladin can do is they cast Flashlight, and if they need more HPS, they cast Holy Light, and they go like way faster. And there's nothing else they can do to like change the game there. Whereas like Priest, you can use your instant Circle of Healing on the tank. You can Penance on the tank if you took that instead. You can shield the tank. There's like so many ways to like protect the tank on Priest that just aren't available on Paladin. That I think Priest just makes the way better complement overall, right? And so there's that. And then the fourth point, and this is like basically the final point, is gear distribution. Now this is kind of the same with the Druid and Paladin. Like both of them can fill this kind of like role most of the time. But again, we already explained why Paladin is not optimal from the third point, right? But there's leather gear in the raid that's basically like tier gear for healing, and I guess for balance, you could say, that Priest cannot equip, because Priest is like cloth and Druid is leather, right? So Druid can equip the Priest gear, but the Priest cannot equip the Druid's gear. So this is kind of like a more minor thing, but it's something worth thinking about. And this is actually a big problem you would see in Original Classic, because you would have like these loot distribution issues where if you look at like an optimal raid group, kind of like an Onslaught or like a Polar raid group in SOM, or I don't think Onslaught played in SOM, but like earlier Classic or SOM for Polar, what you would basically see is you would see a ton of warriors, and you'd see them all with like vendor weapons, right? You'd see them with like AV weapons, or like basically any weapon you could get that wasn't from a raid. Or well, actually, what you would see in those guilds is you would probably see rank 14 weapons, right? But basically, you'd either have like a rank 14 weapon, or you would have, a weapon from some easily available PvE quest or source or something like that was reliable that you could get all the time. And obviously, if you had, rank 14 weapons, this wasn't really a problem because rank 14 weapons were really good. But if you had the other weapons, like for example on Horde side in SOD, a lot of our warriors were using, I think, the blue axe from AV for quite a bit. And the problem with that is, like, because you have so many warriors in the raid, right, your loot distribution in terms of getting actual damage weapons is terrible. Because, you get one weapon, you have to get 16 more weapons, and that's just a main hand, Some of these people have to dual wield. All these warriors are dual wielding and stuff like that, right? So it kind of works the same way in this 10-man, where if you didn't have a druid in the 10-man, what ends up happening is this leather gear is just completely wasted. And some of it's actually pretty good, especially for the druid itself, because the druid is casting a lot more like spells than the priest, right? The priest only has to worry about basically casting I believe Homunculi can't miss, like, the initial cast, right? Because it's just a summon. So you just summon the Homunculi if you're using that. And then the Void Plague, if that resists or something, you can just instantly recast the global. And then it's up for 16 seconds, right? Whereas if your Star Surge resists, or if your Wrath resists, like, that's a little bit more annoying, right? Your Fairy Fire resists. Again, you can just recast that global, but now you're not doing the rest of your rotation, right? So having the extra hit from the Druid Leather tier set is definitely really nice. But it's really more just that the tier set itself being leather, that it's not like if you don't have a Druid in your raid, it can't drop, right? It can still drop all the time. So having a Druid helps get that gear on somebody useful faster, right? Whereas if you had like 2 priests or something, that gear would just get sharded, and you would need the priest tier chest essentially to have the equivalent, right? So it's something you should always try and think about. Like in some cases, like original classic, decisions weren't really made around gear distribution because warrior was just so much better than all the other classes DPS wise that it didn't matter if they were using like AV weapons, right? They were still better. So in those cases, it's not really a problem. However, the idea of this season seems like we're going to try and have things that are a lot closer to some sort of optimal balance. And if that's going to be the case, then, gear distribution is going to be something that's going to be looked at definitely more seriously than it was, at least, right? Because if things are close, now you really do have to start thinking like, okay, like maybe it is better to take this other class that maybe doesn't do quite as much damage as this like pure warrior DPS, right? But it's going to absorb gear we're going to get from the raid, and it actually may do more damage when everything is said and done because it actually has gear, whereas like that other class that we had to bring if we're stacking that class would actually be naked, right? Because like the worst warrior in your raid is going to be like basically naked compared to like, the Boomkin who actually has access to caster gear, right? I'm not saying that like Boomkin is going to have DPS warrior or anything like that in a strict sense. Like we don't know anything that's going to happen in the future. I'm just saying that assuming you have 2 classes that are relatively equal, right, regardless of what those classes may be, at that point it becomes way less of an incentive to class stack, because class stacking just hurts you, especially with how gear works in Classic, where I don't know if we're going to get like a token system like they have in retail and stuff, where you can like use tier tokens go between like 4 classes. Like I don't really think we have that in retail, so or I don't think we're going to get that in Classic. So you're basically going to be stuck with whatever drops in the boss, and being able to utilize that gear is much better than not being able to utilize it, right? So that's basically, I think, covers everything. I think this is a bit of a quicker one, a little atypical for me, still not super quick, but yeah, that basically covers why I think the Druid and Druid and Priest synergy is so strong. It's just like really, really solid, and I think that it'll continue into the next phase for sure. I don't know if we're gonna have a 10-man or if it's gonna be 20-man. I have an inkling that it's probably gonna be another 10-man. It sounds like. It seems like they flirted with the idea of making it 20, but it seems like from what we've been hearing recently, it might just be another 10. So if it's another 10, then the same dynamic is probably gonna apply. And the one thing I think is Paladins will just be a stronger class. So that'll be a little bit interesting to see because they'll have their illumination, they'll have some more crit, right? And they'll have like higher rank spells. So that should be a little bit interesting. But I think that the same general principle is going to apply. I think that one thing is that as other classes begin to scale more, I'm unsure how relevant the healer DPS is really going to be. And I'm going to make a video about healer DPS. But I think even now, people are very overestimating, like, how much, like, what is a healer also DPSing, like, what is their overall contribution to the raid from the DPS perspective, right? And it's really something that you do, in my opinion, just as a safety net, right? So in other words, like, the idea is you want to have the two healers there, and since they're not really both needed to heal, you might as well have one do damage and have it be the Druid, because the Druid is the best at dealing damage, right? Like, we've already kind of covered that a little bit, but it's not, like, you don't bring the Druid because it's a pumper, if that makes sense, right? Like, the Druid is not doing, like, mind-blowing DPS, like, ever, really, right? Especially if it's having to heal. Even if it's not having to heal, though, it's not really doing, like, super good DPS, maybe on the turtle boss, right? But that's kind of obviously an exceptional circumstance. So, I think people are already overvaluing, like, a healer's ability to do damage now, especially in, like, a non-speed or a non-parse scenario. Obviously, if you're trying to parse and you're trying to kill the boss as quickly as possible, being able to do more damage helps, right? Same thing with speed clearing. But in a normal scenario, it's not particularly useful. And I actually think that it's going to get worse as the content scales up, because I think that the DPS classes, like the pure DPS, are going to get even more scaling, and I'm not sure if the actual, like, healer classes are going to have, like, their abilities keep pace with the DPS, right? So in terms of, like, if you were doing, like, 5% of raid damage, which may even be an overestimate, I haven't really looked, like, super in detail, I'll do that in the other video, but let's just say you're doing, like, 5% of raid damage currently as a DPS healer Druid or whatever, you may do, like, 3% next phase or 2% next phase, right? So I think that when you add that into the equation, then maybe things start to shift a bit more towards Paladin. But again, I do think that just the synergy between their abilities in terms of what healing abilities you're actually casting is still really good. So I think the combination will endure. It'll be a solid combination for probably as long as we have 10-man content. It's just that the degree to how good it is may change, right? So, like, relative to the other class pairings. Especially if Shaman's going to get chain heal and stuff in the next level, so that should be interesting, right? So we'll have to keep an eye on things, and I'll just let you know what I think when it comes to that, right? But for now, Priest and Druid's amazing. If you get a Priest friend or a Druid friend, and they're the person to heal with, basically. But don't worry too much about it. Like, you'll get through the raid on pretty much any class combo if you just pay attention, do the mechanics, and do things properly. So don't be, like, too discerning to the point where you're not playing with people over what class they're playing or any bullshit like that, right? It's really not, like, that important. It just is, right now, there is kind of, like, that cool synergy going on between the two classes, but it's not a game-breaking thing, right? It pretty much probably will never be a game-breaking thing in SOD. That's what the devs are at least striving to make sure it doesn't happen, at least. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and we will have more videos coming soon. Yeah, thank you so much. If you really liked it, like, subscribe, and recommend it to your friends. And thank you guys so much. See you next time.